Just the other day, I was suffering from an extreme bout of depression and contemplating whether or not I could commit seppuku with a porcelain piggy bank. But then, finally, after 7 years by my reckoning, The Witcher Blood Origin ended, and I felt much better. For a whole 10 seconds until I realized this is it. I just watched the death of fantasy. I watched the bloody criminal murder of the fantasy genre on television and probably movies as well for our current era. Much like E.T. placed its sausagey fingers around the throat of video gaming in 1983 and began to squeeze, Blood Origin is the death knell, the bloody candelabra, the instrument of murder of the modern-day fantasy entertainment genre. And of course, it's not all Blood Origin's fault, despite its countless hate crimes against the art of fun, against magic, and against basic values of entertainment and storytelling. This is merely the last nail, the final piece of iron in a coffin that the mainstream has been building for fantasy for quite some time now. Oh, don't get me wrong, there will still be some fantasy shows. There is still the Rings of Power and the Wheel of Time. There will be starved, ghoulish corpses stalking through the streets in desperate search of an audience for some time yet. But they will all be the same zombie, having long since devoured any last vestige of magic or fantasy from the universes that they now haunt. As they will all follow the same destructive dogma of diversity. And let us not forget representation. Now, this is a big topic that many of us have been seeing for a very long time now. I remember one of my true clarity moments on this came as recently as the Rings of Power, where I was watching Sauron and Galadriel. I was watching elves and dwarves and orcs battle one another, and all I could see were fucking Californians LARPing. No, you know what? That would be an insult to LARPers, because at least they look like they might actually belong in a fantasy setting. What modern day entertainment has done is so much worse than that. Let me show you, perhaps the single best example of all of this. The Wheel of Time. A high fantasy setting of magic, of monsters, and evil gods. Here, in this cast, right here, you've got a werewolf dude who talks to wolves, a sorceress, a bonded monk-like samurai sword master bodyguard, and the most powerful magic wielder in the entire Wheel of Time universe, possibly excluding only Satan himself. And what do you see? 7 peasants in slightly different variants of muted, dull-coloured, dirty robes. The same dull-coloured, dirty robes as every other fantasy series. Here we have Sauron, the Lord of the Rings, the personification of evil, as just some guy wearing sackcloth. And in yet another third supposed fantasy universe, we have another band of dirty, disheveled peasants in robes. There is no fantasy here. There is no magic, there is no mystery, there is no wonder. Just hobos walking along a dusty road. This has become the aesthetic of the fantasy show now, as you see it in every last single solitary one of them. And I like to remind you what fantasy used to look like. Let's go all the way back in time to shows like Young Hercules. A show so cheesy you can feel your skin turning yellow as you watch it. And yet, it's fantasy. Show this picture to any normie even today and they will recognize it as a fantasy show. Hammy as ever-loving hell, but obviously, self-evidently fantasy. Or the vastly superior opposite, Xena Warrior Princess. Again, immediately and instantly recognizable for what it is, swords and sorcery awesomeness. Heck, even the bad stuff from back then at least looked the part. For example, He-Man, Masters of the Universe, the movie. These guys are dressed in a lovely ensemble of plastic and polyester and tin, and yet they still look far more like fantasy characters than something from today with a budget of $500 million. And obviously, this is deliberate. No question about it at any point. If the 80s can give us this, then there is absolutely no reason whatsoever on this good green earth of ours that the 2000s should give us this: the ballsack armor with a penis head for a helmet. This is, of course, what we call sabotage. Or subversion, if you wish, as the entire point is to undermine and to destroy the setting that is being adapted, so that it can be replaced by something the showrunner or director or writer likes better, their greater good, which in the current year of course means their choice of gendered or racialized ideology and politics. This has become the ironclad rule of modern day entertainment, not just in fantasy, but in entertainment in general, with the most obvious and famous example, of course, being there was not a soul in a single movie theater across the globe that did not let out an audible sigh at that scene. And of course, it was just the beginning of Luke's suffering in a movie and a trilogy remembered near solely for the damage it did to Star Wars as a setting and as a universe. It reduced Luke Skywalker, the Titan of Star Wars, second only, maybe, to Darth Vader himself, to a man who would try to kill his best friend's son. It turned him into a grumpy, old, jaded hermit that gave up on the Jedi Order and spends his days sucking blue milk from the tits of alien bug monsters. They even have Yoda's ghost make an appearance just to burn the last shreds of the Jedi Order which Luke had been protecting right in front of them. And then, finally, when there is nothing more to take from him, the movie cocks the gun, puts it to his head, and pulls the motherfucking trigger. It was the murder of a century, and yet but the hors d'oeuvres of what was to come, as it set down the blueprint for reducing every single once beloved franchise into what they are now: bland, undistinguishable mud. And again, it happens everywhere. Let's take the Wheel of Time, for example. Rand al-Thal, the Dragon Reborn, is the most powerful magic user in that world, again, possibly only second to the Lord of Darkness, actual literal Satan. In the books, he has a grand debut of his absurd powers as he wipes out an entire army of bestial monsters single-handedly. This is done to fully hammer into the heads of the reader what an utter and absurd powerhouse this guy is, and to set in stone the stakes and the power level of the world. In the TV series, Randall Thal goes into the woods with a woman who needs to protect him from Satan because he fucks up massively and would have been defeated instantly were it not for her intervention and the destruction of the army. That scene was stolen by a handful of side characters and people you hadn't even met until an episode ago. And this, of course, was but the latest demonstration of hypocrisy from the people making this garbage. One of the main actors in The Wheel of Time had crowed rather happily about how in this show it was the men who always had to take off their shirts. They were the sexual objects here and had to work out and stuff. They were the things to be objectified. And when it was happening to men, it was of course A-OK. But it would have been awful if it had been happening to women. And thus reducing the Dragon Reborn to a damsel in distress too is just fine and dandy. It's a good role for him, you see, even as the strong and independent women take over his main role, cheapening the universe in the process. Because here's the thing again, in this world, in the Wheel of Time, male magic casters are vastly more powerful than the female ones. However, they are also much more volatile and susceptible to the seductions of darkness and will invariably go mad and try to murder people. There was an actual apocalypse caused by this in the world, and the females now police the male magic casters, forbidding them from using magic and severing them from the source of it. The only exception to this is the Dragon Reborn, who is so absurdly OP that he's capable of remaining sane even whilst everyone else goes insane. But now that a bunch of female magic casters can do what the Dragon Reborn could, just as easily, where they can bring the dead back to life, even as the Dragon Reborn is easily defeated, his character has no further role in this series. The entire universe has been undermined, subverted, and cheapened to the point where the main character is nothing special any longer. And you see this again in Rings of Power. Again and again, in fact, in Rings of Power. Mount Doom, the volcano created by Morgoth himself, it was just a geological phenomenon, you see. It was a steam explosion created by goblins that made the volcano. Bearing in mind too, volcanoes in Middle-earth aren't just mere volcanoes, they are sources of evil. Literal furnaces raised by the powers of evil, in fact. But no, now it's just a thing that happens when orcs take a leak into the lava. And let's not even begin talking about Sauron, who was depicted specifically in the Peter Jackson movies as a monstrosity, a creature of sheer annihilation and destruction, a titanic towering figure of armored metal, specifically to make him a larger-than-life threat. And then, as an enormous burning eye atop a tower, is now some random dude found in the middle of the ocean as Galadriel decided to swim home. And obviously, in Blood Origin as well, as the very first Witcher was apparently an elf. And they turned him into a witcher just because, well, you know, they figured they needed to. There was a big locust animal flying around, zapping people with its tentacles, and so a witcher was the logical answer. Right? Right? Of course. Of course. The witches were not created through a long and torturous process by humanity that had arrived in a predatory and aggressive world, where they could only hope to defeat the demons that dwelled in the darkness with experimentations with magic, with demon blood, and horrific self-sacrifice. No. It was the elves all along who did this, you see, in a hole in the wall over the course of a couple of hours, as a dwarf who talks to her hammer nailed the elf in question to the floor. That was it. That was all. It had nothing to do with humans or their quest for survival whatsoever. Which, of course, again, cheapens the entire setting. The witches in the setting are a desperate bid for survival. They are a crime against humanity and the laws of nature so that humanity could live. And they are treated as monsters for it. That is what makes them tragic characters. But forget all about that. It was an elf all along that had to defeat a locust, you see. And it all stems from the precise same place. All of these writers and showrunners and directors haven't just coincidentally happened upon the same slippery turd. It comes from a deeply selfish and disgustingly arrogant need to force their own values upon others. Or perhaps even more so, the inability to understand or accept that others may have values at all, as the only value they see is race and gender, to be fair. And if they indeed do recognize that other people have values at all, these two things are far more important than any petty concern of the audience for which they are making the show. In theory, at least. I mean, what does the audience know, eh? They've only been fanatic fans of these things for years and decades in some cases, and might have been waiting breathlessly to finally see their favourite universe on the big screen. Clearly, it is far more important that some screenwriter gets to virtue signal about race-swapping another ginger character. It's the kind of self-obsession that's the hallmark of Greek tragedies. And if nothing else, the execution of fantasy certainly is reason enough to have a good cry about it, I suppose. And the reason that this is happening will not change because the religion is as strong as ever. Blood Origins still has defenders. Despite being a show so apocalyptically bad as to make the Rings of Power look good. And they're not defending the plot. They're not defending the characters, or the story, or the visuals, or the acting. They are defending the fact that there's a midget and a deaf person in the cast. The most irrelevant things imaginable to a show. The actors' own attributes, not those of their characters, not those of the roles in which they play, no, their real life attributes. Them as actual people come above the characters they are paid to portray. These are professional actors that still have the balls, the sheer hubris to place themselves, well, not even themselves, their characteristics above that of the job that they are hired to portray. Oh, and on the topic of the midget as well, there's the thing. Again, another beautiful point. It is just a midget. It is just a short person. It is not a dwarf. They are not the same thing. This is just a short woman. They put in zero effort to make her look like a dwarf. Story? Oh, my Jesus. We often talked about how every character written by these modern-day fantasy showrunners turns out to be unironically evil. But this one doesn't take the cake. It is the cake. So, listen here. The short person has a hammer. Inside of the hammer is the soul of her murdered friend and or gay lover. Or so we are told, as the short person frequently is seen speaking to the hammer. The nature of these conversations usually revolve around the short person violently murdering random strangers at bars, apparently, who have also, again, we have been told, been near an elf, apparently, who allegedly raped and murdered the girl who is now inside the hammer. The only source we have of this allegation, or there even having been a murder in the first place, is the short person who speaks to their hammer. Finally, after tracking down the alleged criminal, the short person beats them to death, and then starts writing on the walls in the dead person's blood. This is not a hero. This is not even an anti-hero. This is merely a psychotic murderer who is justifying their violent crime spree by saying, "Trust me, bro, my hammer speaks to me." But absurd story aside, yes, it again illustrates the central point of all of this by placing the focus on representing the people, not the characters, the people playing the characters, on black and brown and beige or short humans. Entertainment has completely failed to represent elves, or dwarves, or Númenóreans, or Haradrim, or anything else. Just because a Gondorian is a white dude does not make him just a white dude from 2022 Earth, nor does a Haradrim having brown skin make him into a current year Arab. And reducing these characters, these identities, the Haradrim, Gondor, elves of the Witcher, and dwarves, which have volumes of laws, enormous wiki pages which they could have looked up at any time, to just the shade of brown or white of the actor playing them, will inevitably make for awful results, but, well, that is only if the result you are looking for is to make a good television series, of course. If your actual purpose is to simply cast people in your friend circle, or those who have the correct shade of skin pigmentation that you like on that evening, then you are very much so successful. And that, of course, is the metric. We have seen it now again and again and again. It is not about recreating a fantasy universe anymore. It is about recreating our world, but with sackcloth. And that is why fantasy is finally dead. And good riddance, because it wasn't fantasy anyways at this point. Let it die. It'll lay dormant for a while, 5, 10, maybe even 20 years, but eventually it will return, and if we're lucky, it'll return in the form of the 80s, rather than the 2000s. Until next time, I've been Arch. Have a good day, and my condolences.